So good
Hi.
morning, everybody, and thank you for being in this call. Today we're going to look at how to get your data securely into a multi-tenant Qlik Sense SaaS setup. So let's look at the agenda. First, we will look at what are the key components of Qlik Cloud with regards to data integration and data analytics. We do a quick deep dive into Qlik Data Integration, an introduction to data movement, the data gateway. We will look at some architecture scenarios, and in the end we can conclude the session with some questions. So let's have a look. What is Qlik Cloud? For today, it's important that we recognize that we have two key parts in Qlik Cloud. We have data services and we have analytic services. They also have a history that they originate from two different companies, and that explains the split, and that's good to have in your mind when looking at the products. So today I'm going to show you how you can get your data in using things inside an app or things which are part of the data services. The two main options to move your data. So let's have a look at data movement. How can you move your data? So like I said in the previous slide, before Qlik took over Attunity, and they had fantastic software to move or replicate your data from one location to the other, or as we call it, a source to a target destination. That were the Attunity products, and that includes software like the Replicate, for example, or Enterprise Manager. So you can move your data from an on-premise to some target, which can be also on-premise or to the cloud. This is what you host yourself. On the other side, we have the Qlik Cloud Data Integration services, which are hosted by Qlik, and which is a SaaS service. There we have two flavors. How can you get your data from on-premise to the cloud, which can also be Qlik Cloud? You can use the Qlik Data Gateway, which is a piece of software you will install behind your firewall in an on-premise setup, and that allows you to move your data into the cloud. So like I said before, in this topic, they talk about data targets. So your data can be moved to a specific data target. The target can be Qlik Cloud or another cloud database, another cloud platform. But as you know, in Qlik Sense, we always had the availability to connect your data using a Qlik connector. That option is of course also still available. So we have the Qlik Data Integration part, and you have the Qlik Cloud Data Integration part. Let's look at Qlik Data Integration at the timelines and how the different products came to exist. So in the past we had client managed software, and there we had Qlik Compose, Qlik Enterprise Manager, Qlik Replicate. Now Qlik Cloud came into existence, and we wanted to move the data from client managed into the cloud. Before we came there, we introduced Qlik Hybrid Data Delivery. And that was a solution that you could move your data from on-premise to Qlik Sense hosted in the cloud. And therefore it was an interim solution because the target was only Qlik Sense. Now Qlik Cloud contains a full platform in which the target can not only be Qlik Cloud, but also other cloud targets. So let's have a look at the Qlik Data Gateway. Actually, there are two Qlik Data Gateways. One for data access from inside the Qlik Sense app, and the other is for data movement. That are the two flavors I talked about in the beginning. The direct access one, which you use inside the Qlik Sense app, for that one you should install a Windows client on your database server or near your database server in your on-premise setup. The data movement part, which is basically what used to be Qlik Replicate, is a Linux component. So it will run on a Linux box in your on-premise setup. So what is the Data Gateway Direct Access? As you can see on the right, if you connect to Qlik Cloud, open Qlik Sense, and you want to add a data connection, the Direct Access Gateway allows you to connect to your local running SQL Server, for example, while working in the cloud. So the developer has no idea that his data is not hosted in the cloud, but that the data is just on-premise. So your Qlik Sense environment runs in Qlik Cloud, and your data can remain on-premise. So it's actually very simple. What is the other option? Well, you can also install the Data Gateway Data Movement. That's the Linux component. And that's part of the Data Integration Suite. It does some clever things. So the Data Gateway Data Movement Gateway allows you to replicate your data and only the deltas from your on-premise environment to a cloud target. The cloud target can be Qlik Cloud, or it can be another cloud database. And what it does is, without impacting the source database, without impacting the performance of the source database, it allows you to, let's say within a time frame of 50 minutes, replicate all the deltas, all the new entries in your source, replicate that into a cloud target. That means your source database is always in sync with your cloud target. And the big advantage, how I see it here, is that if you look at the Qlik Sense scenario, that you don't have to think about updating your QVDs or updating your apps or how to get fresh data in. You basically just reload your data every 50 minutes and it also contains fresh data. You don't have to think about writing the delta load scripts, etc. So let's have a look at the Data Gateway Direct Access in a more detailed way. Here we have an architecture diagram in which in the bottom you will find your enterprise data sources. You will also see that we installed the Qlik Data Gateway behind your firewall. So if users now open a Qlik Sense app and try to create a data connector, they will have access to your local data in Qlik Cloud. So during an app reload, the data will be loaded from your on-premise database into Qlik Cloud. And of course, you can combine data from multiple sources in Qlik Sense. So you can also load data from other cloud sources and combine that with your local data in the Qlik Sense app. Let's now look at the Data Gateway data movement. Again, you have your enterprise data sources in the bottom. You will install a data gateway, the Linux variety, on-premise. And the data gateway allows to move your data from on-premise to a cloud target. Qlik Cloud, your Qlik Cloud tenant, contains Data Integration Management Console, and that allows you to set all settings required for the movement to take place. So the Qlik Cloud tenant is basically a control plane that talks to the data movement gateway, which is hosted on premise, and it basically manages the movement. So this is one of my favorite ways to move the data. If you just look at Qlik Sense, so my background is Qlik View and then Qlik Sense. So then we moved to Qlik Cloud, and I thought, okay, how to get your data in? Because normally your data is behind the firewall, and people don't like to open their firewall. So how do I get the data in? And I did use Delta load scripts in the past, but they can become quite cumbersome and difficult to maintain. So I was never a big fan of those. And then Qlik came with the Qlik Data Gateway, and it basically solved my whole issue. The data gateway data movement one I'm now talking about, which you see on the screen. Because it basically allows me to connect to my data sources which are on-premise, and it allows me to have fresh data into the cloud. So every 15 minutes my data is being updated in the cloud. And by the way, I'm now talking about data gateway data movement, which used to be hybrid data delivery. And what it basically does is it moves your data. For each table, it creates a QVD in a bucket in AWS. And it's just a normal QVD. And that normal QVD I can just load into my Qlik Sense app like I did before. So I can basically forget about the whole data movement part. Me as an app developer, I just connect to a folder, and in that folder are always fresh, updated QVDs. I don't have to think about writing delta loads, or my data is always up to date, but I'm now using Qlik Cloud, so I don't have to think about hosting anymore, etc. And what you basically do is the first time you do a full load of your data, so you make a complete copy of your source table and you load it in the QVD. And next, using change data capture technology, CDC, we sync or replicate all changes to the cloud. And it does that by the local client, the Qlik Data Gateway, looks using some smart technology. It looks at the log files of your database server and then replicates only those changes to the active QVD. And this process is again managed by the Qlik Cloud tenant, by the data integration part inside the Qlik Cloud tenant. So we have two gateways. So when will you use which gateway? Well, it depends on your data refresh requirements. So how often do you need to get fresh data in your dashboard or in your cloud target? Can also be another database, of course, instead of Qlik Sense. It depends on whether you care about the impact a data load has on the data source server. So if you care about the impact, then change data capture technology is very efficient. If you don't really care, for example, if you load during the night and your users are working during the day, then you can also use the direct access gateway. Also the ease of use of Chase data capture technology. You just install it and you have your data in the cloud, basically. It's always fresh, up to date. You don't have to write load scripts. It also depends on the size of your data. Is it a very big table, or do you have small tables? Because with the load script, if you do select from where, the where clause will scan the complete table. So that's a high impact on your source server. So it's not only the size of your table, but it's also the size of the data you want to move. Depending on your cost structure, it cannot be efficient to move complete table every day, but you only want a few kilobytes of data on the line versus gigabytes. So let's look at some architecture scenarios. So what is the basic architecture? So here we have an on-premise setup. We installed the data gateway, which can connect to your sources. In Qlik Sense, you have an app, and that app can combine data from multiple sources. So if you have an on-premise setup, but then in your own virtual private cloud, of course, you can also install a Qlik Data Gateway over there. So basically, you install a gateway at locations where your data source is behind the firewall. And the data gateway allows you to connect to your data source, even though there's a firewall, without you to having an inbound connection from the internet to your on-premise environment. So what's the other scenario we can look at? Well, if you have multiple environments for your development, test, or production, you can install a gateway for each environment to keep the data separated. And in your Qlik Cloud tenant, you can then create a data space for each environment. So next, we're gonna look at some use cases for OEM scenarios. And an OEM scenario is a scenario in which you embed Qlik Sense into your software. And most of the time you have a SaaS platform in a multi-tenant fashion. So you have one web server on which you have multiple customers using the system, and each customer should not see the data and users of other tenants. So how do you get the data in? Let's look at some data movement flows. So data movement was the technology on the data integration part of Qlik Cloud, where we use change data capture technology to move your data. So what does it look like in a multi-tenant setup? So on the left, we have your OEM host, as we call it, your SaaS platform, the source of your SaaS platform. So here, in most cases, you will have a database for each customer. For each database, we will create a data movement task after we installed the data gateway, of course. And the task contains the settings for like, hey, this is the namespace of my customer. So all tables with customer 1 star need to be replicated to the cloud target. So I installed the Qlik Data Gateway. I created an AWS bucket for each customer. Actually, I created 2 buckets, one for the input and one for the output. So I moved my data using a data movement task to a landing zone in AWS. Next, Qlik Cloud Data Integration will take the data and create up-to-date QVDs. Those will be stored, and I call it an output bucket. So this is the input for the data movement task, and this is the final output, which contains QVDs. On the right, I will have Qlik Cloud, Qlik Sense. Here I created a tenant for each of my customers. So that's what we call a tenant per tenant. In the end, I don't have to know anything about data movement or difficult configuration. In the end, I just have one bucket for each customer. So customer 1, all the data for customer 1 is inside the bucket 1. So if I have an app here, I could just say, hey, load star from these tables contained in this bucket. So now I have a situation where I can host my dashboards in the cloud using Qlik Sense, and my data is also in the cloud using the Qlik Data Movement solution. So we will now look at some more detailed diagrams. In this diagram, you'll see a complete integrated solution containing the embedding, the authentication, and the automation part, what we also saw in the last Espresso meeting. So I can embed Qlik Sense content using the iframe or div tag or using the APIs. The user will log in into your SaaS platform. They will see Qlik Sense embedded using an iframe or div tag. They will log in into your SaaS platform. Your SaaS platform will now forward the user's identity to Qlik Cloud using JWT or OIDC. Your SaaS platform will also configure a tenant for each of your tenants using the REST APIs. So if you now look at on the right side, you'll see that we have created a tenant for each of your tenants. So I have customer tenant 1 and tenant 2. Tenant 1 gets all its data from the bucket in S3. So here I have a customer app with customer 1 data. I create an S3 connection inside the Qlik Sense tenant, which just loads data from my Amazon S3 bucket. In there are QVDs. And as we discussed before, the data gateway data movement replicates the data for each of your tenants to the AWS bucket, which is then loaded into Qlik Sense tenant. With direct access, we have the same picture. So we also have a tenant per tenant in Qlik Cloud, but now I use a direct access connection to load my data via the data movement direct access from the source database into the app. And don't forget, all the things you did before are still possible. So if you're using Qlik Cloud, if you're using Qlik Sense in Qlik Cloud, and you want to load your data into an app, you can still use, of course, the REST connector to load your data from your data source if that data source is available out on the internet. So you only have to use the data gateways, of course, if your data is behind the firewall and the firewall is closed. So where can you find more information about Qlik Sense Client Managed or Qlik Cloud, or if you want to migrate from Client Managed to the Qlik Cloud? We updated integration.qlik.com. It now also includes Qlik Cloud content and the specific chapter about the migration and what to do with your web integration or your data, your security APIs, etc.